Welcome everyone to our first installment of London Calling. I'm Gloria Kondrup. I am the Executive Director of the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography at ArtCenter College of Design. And this is the first in a series that we're having of our wonderful designers and typographers from London. It's because of the situation, they couldn't be with us, of course. So the best thing we can do is invite as many as you can to our wonderful lectures. It will be led by my co-host, Professor Simon Johnston, and creative director of the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography. I will disappear rather quickly, and I'm going to turn this over to Simon. If we have time at the end, hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, and you see the Q&A on your Zoom screen. That's where you will ask your questions, and hopefully we'll get to answer them. And I'll be back. So I want to welcome you, Lucy. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And Simon, the show is yours now.
All right, thank you, Gloria.
You're welcome.
Lucy, great to see you. We should have been meeting in London a couple of weeks ago, but obviously that hasn't happened. I've got a sort of an official and an unofficial introduction for Lucy. We actually first met way back in, I think, 86 or 87 in London, when Lucy, then I think possibly still a student,
yes,
came to visit my design studio, 8VO in Covent Garden. Students, you should look up the 1980s. They came before the 90s, but were obviously much cooler. So anyway, scroll forward many, many years, and Lucy was, with her family, came to HMCT to be a typographer in residence in 2018. And I'd invited them over for lunch one day, and walking around my studio, Lucy pointed to a spine of a book on my shelf, which turned out to be, if I can show it briefly, Typographic Design by Raymond Roberts, her father. And I had never, to be honest, put the two together. So that was a really nice coincidence. As you know, Lucy runs Lucienne Roberts Plus, a London-based design studio. Their work spans exhibition design, books, and corporate identity for screen, 3D, and print, and is mostly engaged with socially aware, an agenda that is socially aware in terms of graphic design. Examples of recent museum projects include Can Graphic Design Save Your Life, which is obviously the basis of the talk today, which was for London's Welcome collection. And she also worked on an exhibition called From Hope to Nope, Graphics and Politics 2008 to 18 at the Design Museum in London. Both of those projects were originated and co-curated by the advocacy initiative Graphic Design which Lucienne is co-founder of. And as I'd mentioned earlier, we were very happy to have Lucy with us as typographer in residence at HMCT in 2018. And her research concluded with an exhibition called Nice, and nice it was, which ran until September 2018. So Lucy, welcome, great to see you. I'll turn it over to you. So,
okay. Well, so the first thing I'm going to do, before I share screen and do a proper kind of screen thing, is just show this, which is the book Can Graphic Design Save Your Life, which is why this talk is called Can Graphic Design Save Your Life. This is the book of the show, the exhibition, and I'll be talking a little bit about why we did it and what the exhibits were and so on. But also just by means of a bit of context, really. My parents were designers. My mum was an illustrator, my dad was a typographer, and they were both politically quite active and engaged, and that made me the same, really, in that I was, we were talking about politics around the dinner table all the time. And so I suppose I've always seen graphic design as a political act, because it's all about sending messages. And that's a kind of underlying thing which will pop up in my talk. But it means that when I left college, the first place I worked was the Women's Press, which was a feminist publisher with the most brilliant logo, which you can hardly see there, but it was an iron, as in Women's Press. Very clever. And it's why I've subsequently written this book, Good, which is about ethics and graphic design. So it's not a surprise, really, that for me, working within the field of health has always been quite important, because I saw that as a kind of useful thing to do as a graphic designer. So I'm just going to share screen now. And so to sort of continue what I was just saying, really, in relation to our work, we've always done quite a lot of work that's in the sphere of health. So here, for example, I'm just going to show 3 projects quickly as a means of sort of context, really, that we worked on the identity for a very strange, tiny little museum about pathology, to do with University College London, housed in part of the Royal Free Hospital in London. And actually the part of it which was most intriguing, apart from looking at these very peculiar samples in bottles all the time, or in jars all the time, was developing this colour coding system for different parts of the body, which is what you see on the left. And it was in old offices at the hospital, so it wasn't a grand space at all. So this is our sign outside those offices. Right at the other end of it, I suppose, this is a very early piece for Breakthrough, the Best Breast Cancer charity, who raised funds for research into breast cancer. And I was external design consultant for a number of years. And this is probably one of my favourite pieces, actually, that I did for them. It was an annual review. At the time, 1 in 12 women in the UK would at some point in their life develop breast cancer. So 12 was a theme, really. We asked 12 photographers to produce pieces of work on that theme. Here are just 2 of them. The most poignant, actually, in a way, is the loaf of bread, because one of Breakthrough supporters had frozen lots of food for her family, knowing that she was likely to pass away. And here's a typographic spread, of which I'm still quite proud, actually. It's kind of unusual for the charity sector, I think, to produce pieces of work like this. But this is the most important project in relation to Can Graphic Design Save Your Life? Because this is an exhibition called Brains at the Wellcome Collection in London. And clearly it was about brains. Here are some brains in jars. And what we found most poignant and intriguing about brains, actually, was that it's the most collected organ, I think, in the world, in that people don't like getting rid of them. They're a bit like the soul, and it feels really wrong to dispose of them. And they're all very meticulously labelled as to whose brain it is and how they died and so on. And we took that as a bit of a theme for our graphics, as you can see. But as I say, the most important element, really, in terms of the story that I'm telling, is that it was for the Wellcome Collection. And the Wellcome are a body in London that fund an enormous amount of medical research. And they also have 2 wonderful gallery spaces. They're very keen to engage the public in all sorts of aspects to do with health. And so we've worked for them, several times. We've done several exhibitions for them. Now it got to 2012 and I set up Graphic Design with my colleague and friend, Rebecca Wright, who's a design educator at Central St Martin's. And our idea at the time was to produce books that foregrounded, that graphic design is always about something else. That's almost its point. It kind of doesn't exist without the other subject. So all our projects are graphic design and something else. And of course we talked about health, and I said, I thought we really great to do something about graphic design and health, and maybe not just a book, maybe an exhibition. And so we went to the Wellcome Collection with a proposal, and our proposal was for a show called Hearts and Minds. It changed later to Can Graphic Design Save Your Life? And they said yes, which was absolutely fantastic. And it's really one of our, for me, it's still one of those kind of dream projects that you count yourself very lucky to have had. So these are just some working sheets to give you a quick overview of the sort of content that it contained. We were really keen that it was international. We were very, very keen that it ticked lots of format boxes, if you like. We wanted packaging, we wanted posters, we wanted digital, we wanted print, we wanted, warnings, we wanted, it was to be as broad as it could be and yet still hang together as a story. And that was in itself was an amazing process, going through projects and deciding what should and shouldn't be used. We also worked with Universal Design Studio. Well, 3D designers. We were art directing it, which is kind of unusual for the 2D to take the lead in an exhibition project, but we did because it was about graphic design and because it was kind of our idea. And so my studio, LR Plus, were responsible for the art direction and for the 2D. And one of the things that we said to our 3D colleagues was that we really wanted it to be very graphic in all ways. So we wanted a massive super graphic on the wall. So what you're looking at now is the plan. You're looking down on the space as if the walls have been flattened, and you can see the typo running around the walls. And we also wanted each section to be assigned an icon, so that if you flew over the space, you would see these shapes that are graphic forms, like the question mark and an H for hospital and so on. And in terms of look and feel, we wanted it to reference the sort of utilitarian that you associate with medical spaces. And of course, we also wanted to use a font that was appropriate. We used New Rail Alphabet, which was designed by Margaret Calvert in the 1960s and also used in a lot of hospitals and had been digitized by A2 SWHK, that's Henrik's company. And so it was couldn't be more appropriate really as a font. Here are some more of our visuals. You can see us working out how that super graphic was going to work around those columns. And here's the model, which was a very beautiful, tiny to scale, version of our forms. So it was split into 6 sections. The first was persuasion. So our sections tended to look at strategies within graphic design and health or spaces. The first was called persuasion, and really it was about smoking, and it was our kind of holding our hands up and saying, well, if we're putting the case for graphic design being really important within health and possibly being instrumental in helping save lives, it can also kill people. So we took smoking as our first section. Then we had education, where of course we looked at how graphic design is employed to teach people about the body. Now, on the whole, our projects were public-facing projects, but we did reference medical students a little bit, and that was here. Then hospitalization, where we looked at the role of graphics in making people feel more comfortable in medical spaces, in the design of ambulance liveries, and all sorts of communication strategies used to help the public understand medical issues in a hospital context. Then the medication section. This was largely focused on pharmaceutical companies and branding. The contagion section, which kind of speaks for itself, but this was about warning and giving information about contagious disease. And lastly, provocation, where we were focusing on design. All design in a way is about behaviour change, but we were looking at projects that were very overtly about behaviour change. So when people arrived, this is what greeted them, this flashing green pharmacy sign that says, "Can graphic design save your life?" which we programmed. And as people walked through into the space, they were greeted first, let's just get that one, by the Red Cross, which in a way I think is probably the most important mark in this context. It's the cross that signifies that a medic in times of war is neutral. And we had to get permission to show it, of course. And then looking across the space here, you see the question mark for education and the beginning of our H for hospital, made out of hospital curtains. Here's medication, looking back towards contagion and provocation. So now let's just look at a few examples. I'm just going to whiz through these really because it's not the main body of my talk as it's turned out. We had to, this is a kind of you have to include it project. This is Geigy, a pharmaceutical company, Swiss pharmaceutical company, most famed for commissioning some of the most important modernist designers in the 50s and 60s. And I think what's interesting here is the use of abstraction. The way that when you're talking about medication, you can't see a lot of what it does. You rub it in, you swallow it, but and it kind of lent itself to quite a minimal and what we would now think of as very Swiss approach to design and typography. The book on the right is by Carl Gersner, who was a great hero of mine. So when I put this in the case, I was a little bit weepy, actually. But We focused on packaging. So here we have the NYC condom produced in 2008 and given out free as part of a safe sex initiative. And using, it's sort of a nod towards the subway system design, which is part of what makes it so of the place. We told the story of, I talked about smoking before, we had to tell the story really of the unbranded cigarette packets, which, you know, is a really interesting thing because these were introduced in Australia first and then into the UK and various other places. And the WHO had identified that branding in this context, you know, people were using the branding of their cigarette packet. It was a bit like the clothes that you wear. It was a way of saying who you are. And it made it very potent. And they argued that it needed to be taken away. And so they introduced guidelines as to the, you know, how large warnings should be, how big picture warnings should be, and the name of the brand had to be at the bottom, always in the same size type, never in bold, always in grey, so it receded into the background. And there were focus groups choosing what's the most revolting background colour, which I find kind of interesting because I'm always saying to students, there's no such thing as a horrible colour, but apparently Pantone 448, I think it is, was the one that was deemed to be most horrid. But of course we had to put we had to be honest and say that, you know, we've also been responsible for selling cigarettes. And one of the most famous campaigns is the Silk Cut campaign of the 1980s by Saatchi and Saatchi, which really, it was just after in this country, cigarette companies weren't allowed to put their name on any adverts. So it's super clever and it won loads of awards because the packets are purple, so the colour was a very strong signifier. But of course, really what was clever was this idea of silk being cut. And it always showed some silk being cut, and it became more and more and more adventurous and surreal. And people, of course, felt, you know, kind of clever. I've got that. You know, it really appealed to people on a sort of intelligence level, which made it all the more terrible, really, in a way, but I cannot say they weren't clever because they were very clever. We looked at hospital interiors. So this is the children's wards at the Royal London, and the work of Mariah Myers-Coffey's worked quite a lot in this field. And here we have graphics that are designed to make the kids feel safer, really, and I guess in a way happier, if one can be, under those circumstances. We also looked at wayfinding. This is in Japan by Kenya Hara, who's one of the art directors for Muji. What I love about these is that on the left, those signs are on fabric and they're washable. And on the right, I love those arrows because the tail of the arrow is an indicator of how much distance you have to travel to get to the place that you're being signed to. We included very small things. The smallest items were probably stamps. These are also about smoking. They've been produced in, I think, 65 countries, anti-smoking stamps, and they're very, you know, you're working in a tiny space. You're having to convey often quite complicated messages, and it's interesting that there are elements that repeated in the stamps that we showed, but often used in very different ways, which were kind of true to that locality. So I think they're interesting and revealing in terms of national design characteristics, if you like. We looked at the livery of ambulances. This is known as the Battenberg pattern. It's named after the Battenberg cake, introduced in 1990s, highly visible at speed. We showed apps that taught kids about the body. We looked, of course, at flip books and at pop-ups and paper books where you peel back parts of the body to reveal what's going on inside. We had projects like this. This is effectively an information design project in A&E in Britain, and it was an attempt to reduce violence in A&E. And what was identified as being key was giving people enough information. And what I think is most clever about this is the panels on the ceiling. So you're lying in bed, you're in accident and emergency, and you look up, and there's an information telling you what will happen to you. We looked at projects that were humorous. This is a campaign in Japan, actually, about smoking, and it's not anti-smoking, it's about being polite to people, which is, and it's done in a very cheeky, kind of funny way. So it's all about, it says, when I bumped into someone, I apologized. When my smoke hit your face, I said nothing. So it's telling you off for being rude as a smoker, as opposed to smoking. And we included student projects. This is a student project from LCC, and it's looking at how you depict pain. Because, you know, how do I know that your pain is the same as my pain? And it was an exploration, really, of how we describe pain visually. Well, so it was a great success, the exhibition. We had over 100,000 visitors, most of whom were not graphic designers, which I think was kind of the point. We didn't want to be preaching to the converted. And here is the most poignant review that we received under the current circumstances. And it reads, "Health crisis, global epidemic, quick for the graphic designer." So that means that quite recently, the AIGA asked me to write a piece for Ion Design around our book about contagious disease and the role of graphic design in trying to prevent the spread of contagious disease. And you know, I cited various projects from the book. One was this poster, for example, by Abraham Games, produced in the 1940s, aimed at soldiers and awareness about malaria. Obviously, Abraham Games is extremely well known for his work during the war and his very beautiful posters. We looked at HIV/AIDS. This is from 1987, Silence Equals Death. What I find most poignant about this, as you can see, is that the pink triangles, it says, was appropriated as a pro-gay symbol in the 1970s by rotating inverted triangle badge that identified homosexuals in Nazi concentration camps. And Ebola, I think this is really interesting because this is a piece of work produced by UNICEF in Sierra Leone, and they talked to us about how they employed local artists to do it. And I think that's always a dilemma for all of us because, you know, it's not about, it's not whether it's beautiful, it's actually does it work? And the point here is really that this is aimed at an audience that is largely still illiterate. The illustrations had to be clear, work, and also speak to them in their own visual language. And that applies, that will come up later in what I'm going to be showing. And of course, I had to mention this, don't die of ignorance, which is most pertinent now. So during the HIV/AIDS crisis, if you like, in the late 1980s, 1990s, the UK government introduced a campaign called AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance. And it was the only time I had ever known until a couple of weeks ago, when every household in Britain got a leaflet about HIV/AIDS. So I guess the thing is really kind of where we are now. And I've been thinking, of course, about if we were doing our exhibition now, what would we do about the current situation? What would we include? What would the story be from a graphic design perspective? It's too early to say really, but I'm going to talk a bit now about the UK's approach, also New Zealand's actually, and then I'm going to talk about designers themselves and how they are responding to our current situation. So what you're looking at here are pictures of our Prime Minister and various other ministers behind lecterns because they speak every day here and announce figures and so on. And it's kind of interesting visual journey that we go from this crest representing government to a website to protect the NHS. Okay, that's the priority. Oh no, maybe that's not the only priority. So then we've got these three messages: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Okay, great. Oh, we need to make it more graphic. So now we've made it a bit more graphic, and then we end up with the most graphic rendition of it, if you like, with the chevrons going around the side, much stronger use of colour. So clearly the red and the yellow are synonymous with warning. And regardless of, you know, what one might feel about it, the niceties of design, and, you know, I'd start honing on letter spacing or something, but really it was very effective. It was a clear message, people understood it, and it was presented visually in a way that made sense. And it was rolled out all over the place. It was up on billboards in Piccadilly Circus. It obviously was used digitally a lot. And it seemed to be pretty effective, actually. Obviously, it was also, as ever, used in humorous ways as well. This is a cartoon in The Guardian. But then this happened. This was a couple of weeks ago, and it changed. The message changed. So it changed to stay alert, control the virus, save lives. And it was in green. And this has caused, you know, a lot of discussion within the design community and more largely because What does stay alert mean? It's not an instruction, really, is it? Stay alert to what exactly? And why is it in green when we all think green means go? There's been a lot of negative press about it. This is in The Guardian. It will cost lives. Experts decry the government's mixed COVID-19 messaging. And in the design press, here we have Design Week, asked a few designers to comment upon it. So we've got, it doesn't seem like the right time to change the message, or it's confused. And comments about the use of colour. And of course, send-ups like be vague, cover your backs, shirk responsibility, or sneak up, shout at the virus and then run away. And my comment was, should I stay or should I go? Which, given that this is called London Calling, this is also from The Clash. And this went up on my Instagram. And it's very, very different to what's happened in New Zealand. And it's interesting that I'm citing New Zealand because along with being asked to comment to Design Week, Creative Reviews asked me to comment about the approach in New Zealand. And they asked a couple of designers actually to consider it in relation to what's been happening in the UK. And I hadn't been that aware of what had been happening in New Zealand, if I'm honest. I was aware that they've controlled the figures very well, but I hadn't looked at how. And to my mind, this was very interesting. I mean, first of all, they did use the term alert. They had these alert levels, but they were very, very clearly defined. Also, of course, their Prime Minister is very personable, but very clear. Whereas in the UK, the criticism of Boris Johnson has been about his ambiguity. Graphically, they again use a colour synonymous with warning, certainly, and a shape at the angled lines. They use illustration more. But actually, from my point of view, what I found most powerful was this. There was an information film called For Tomorrow. The campaign is called Unite Against COVID-19. And it opens here with this empty rugby pitch. And I found it really very, very moving because it shows images of empty spaces. Those are playgrounds and shops and restaurants and so on, as you can see. But instead of that being presented as a negative, it's being presented as a sign of responsibility, and that we everyone, needs to pull together to make this work. And the voiceover says something about, it only takes one person to lose, but it takes everybody to win. And that is such a powerful idea. And it's a really positive one as well, because it's essentially saying if we all do this together and pull together, we'll get through it better and more quickly. And actually, to me, that was what has been most marked by this, because it places sort of trust in people. It assumes the best of people. So from that perspective, I found it heartwarming and something that I think has been lacking here. So I just have to reference NICE now. Gloria mentioned, and you mentioned, Simon, as well, that I was typography in residence in 2018, and my project was called NICE. And I was looking at a poster that reads, "Slogans in nice typefaces won't save the human races." And this poster had been posted up in London. And it had featured in the exhibition that we'd also curated about graphics and politics. And I thought it was a sort of a critique, really, of designers doing their own political posters, but actually only speaking to other people like themselves. And I wanted to say, well, I think designers aiming a bit higher than that. And that was the purpose of my project NICE, really. So I sort of deconstructed the message of that poster, and in a way tried to argue that I think design can make a difference. That's the point. So of course, in the current situation, lots and lots and lots of designers have been producing work. I mean, really masses of it. So an example would be this by Morag Myerscough. Now, she was asked to do this by a small charitable organisation in Leeds to say thank you to the staff that work in our hospitals and within the NHS. And it went up on a billboard in Leeds, and it really caught people's imagination, I think, because it's so positive, and it's almost celebratory, even though we've been going through a dire time. But it's been so applauded that it ended up being used on posters outside people's houses. And here it is on a billboard in the street. It's actually now, only yesterday, adorning some beer cans, I gather. And she's painted it also outside her studio. So this is an interesting example of, she was asked, there was a client, if you like, although I don't think any money would have changed hands. But it's a designer sort of really putting her heart and soul into trying to convey a positive message. I was interested in this. This was produced by a colleague in our studio, actually, on Instagram, and he walked the letters of the NHS, which I found very touching and poignant. And again, it's a sort of uplifting message, I suppose, but it's also about awareness raising. Now, clearly, I would say that politics and health go hand in hand, and particularly now, there's no denying that, you know, our feelings here, for example, will be as much about the government. It's not, you know, we don't have a coalition government, it's a Conservative government. And so it is a party political issue. And so, of course, there's been criticism. And I love this message because I think it's very funny, really. So Tories are Conservative. So it says, dear Tory voters, at the next election, please stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, which I think is just tremendously witty. And it's a really clever reworking of the slogan that I showed you at the beginning. And also within the political context, I find this interesting. This is the work of Fraser Muggeridge, who's a graphic designer in London, working with Jeremy Deller, who's an artist, who've produced this poster that reads, "Thank God for Immigrants." And it's to raise funds for a refugee charity and a food bank. And of course, it is, again, a political comment because so many people working in our health system here are immigrants. And particularly of late, there's been a lot of negative talk about immigrants. And so I think it's a good kind of wake-up call, particularly because every Thursday night here in the UK, we're clapping to say thank you to key workers. And it's a kind of reminder of, you know, you've got to follow through on this because we don't have joined up thinking about this. There've been a lot of calls for designers to contribute to different projects. So one on the left here, we have a project by Federagomi, the paper manufacturer, who asked 19 designers to produce posters about staying home. And on the right, we have another competition that was run by Wallpaper magazine. And I'm interested by these because, I mean, clearly I get the impression very strongly that the designers, you know, designers desperately want to use their skills for good causes. They really want to make a difference. Obviously, the government campaign is the territory of government and it's controlled by, you know, it's rolled out by a large agency and so on. But I think designers really, really want to do their bit. The problem for me is always, you know, how much of this work is only seen by other designers. And that's what I think is interesting about Morag's piece, for example, that no, it is on the streets. And Fraser's, actually, because people are sticking his immigrant poster up in their windows. I don't know about these, I'm not passing a comment as such, and they're generally raising funds for very good causes too, so, you know, that makes them hugely worthwhile, of course. But it's an interesting question as to the effectiveness, what we mean by effective design thing. In the States, so in New York, I know that Poster House, the museum in New York, got together with Print magazine and asked designers to produce works that would be used in Times Square. This is the part that you see here is the work of Emily Overman at Pentagram. And for the typographers amongst us, of course, it uses this great glyph, so the A can move all the time, so it's shifting from one direction to another, so it is close and then apart and close and then apart. What I thought with this initiative actually was how it was very much the great and the good actually. This is Milton Glaser reworked his cover for New York magazine from 1968 to sort of, I guess, draw emphasis to what was happening most particularly in New York and sort of lift spirits, but also, you know, unite the city. And here we have a piece, as you see again in Times Square, by Mario Carmen, loving the time of coroner as opposed to cholera, which was the original wording. But I think those are interesting because they're the kind of the great and the good from graphic design perspective, which is fantastic, of course. But there've also been lots and lots of initiatives that have been more, have been sort of all-encompassing, and that's some of what I'm going to talk about now. This is interesting, actually. This is Amplified Art, who are in Seattle. They're a not-for-profit organisation. They don't just run campaigns about COVID, but they have been obviously about COVID. And we've got a piece by Shepherd Ferry on the left. I think what's interesting here is also that they're both trying to raise awareness about behaviour change and so on, but also thanking health workers and also looking at the wider political situation as we are here, really. You know, how can government help people who are suffering financially at this time? And they're selling a lot of the posters to raise funds to help people. I think what's interesting about this organisation is that it's my understanding that they also are paying some of the designers for their work. So moving on to two projects that I'm going to conclude with, really, which are kind of open call projects. So the UN put out an open call to creatives to produce work to help them convey the core messages around COVID. This brief was, as I understand it, aimed primarily at people working within the creative industries. It was shared very widely on platforms like Creative Review, It's Nice That, I'm sure Ion Design ran something. And it was reaching out to creatives and asking them to help the UN. They were inundated with responses, and so they organised, they went to Talent House, who are a company that help corporate clients, actually commercial clients, find the right creatives. But Talent House, I think, offered their time for free in helping kind of organise these thousands and thousands of submissions, because they did have to vet them, obviously. And that the idea was that they're not vetting them from a design perspective in terms of form, they were vetting them in terms of accuracy and whether they would be useful in the wider cause. They were very clear about the messages that had to be conveyed. They had to look at personal hygiene or physical distancing, or explaining the symptoms. Talk about kindness, which I think is interesting. Truth, what you can trust, and also encouraging people to donate where they could. To my mind, what's interesting about this, and it goes back to the Sierra Leone Ebola poster, really, is that the UN were very clear that they wanted a really international response, and they wanted a really real breadth in the response, because different people need different visual communication. They understand different visual communication, and this is absolutely key. And of course, right. And so it was, to my mind, it was very interesting to see the kinds of responses that they got. So there are thousands of them, and you can see them on the Talent House site. But I've just looked at a few here that are all about masks. So you can look at these pieces, you can see who's done them. The UN themselves are sharing a lot of them on their social media, and they're inviting other people to use them as they need, really. But the variety just on this one subject is fantastic, and very often very funny, often referencing kind of national characteristics or objects here that are synonymous with a particular place, and of course particular people. So I think this is interesting, because I can't, if I were curating Can Graphic Design Save Your Life now, I would be mesmerised by the amount of material just on this one subject, and you could do an exhibition just on these. I think what's interesting is how you would end up from a curatorial perspective, deciding what the stories really are and what's in and what's not. There has been a little bit of critique of the UN here in terms of money, because clearly people are doing this work for free, and it's being shared widely with no payment, based on the assumption that that it's not being used to make money. I'm sure if one of these pieces ended up on a tea towel somewhere, there would, you know, there'd be some repercussions. But nevertheless, I think the issue around asking anyone to work for free is always a difficult one. But at the same time, I understand completely why designers want to do it, because they are just desperate to be contributing in a positive way. And another project that's interesting is this one. This is Stay Sane, Stay Safe, a Dutch initiative. 2 Dutch designers and 1 Dutch writer have worked on this. And they really wanted to, again, it was an open call to designers to design posters that could go up in hospitals and could be shared more broadly with messages that were positive. They were very keen to try and keep spirits up, but would also be informative. And also what I thought was interesting with them is that they commented that so many designers at the moment don't actually have enough work, but want to be making all the time. But that was also part of why they put this project together. And within, you know, a couple of weeks, they had, I don't know, 1,500 entries. And WeTransfer supported them. This is the WeTransfer page showing some of the results. Guardian have run quite a lot of them. I love these. It's very interesting in terms of, it's a bit like our stamps, really, when we were choosing smoking stamps, that we were interested by when the same device is used, but in very different ways. So, of course, here we have hands. These are clearly designed to lift spirits. And there's a lot of humour here too, particularly the middle one, which is about how you can suntan whilst in quarantine. And here they are in use. Here's one poster in a hospital on the left and projected onto a building on the right. This interested me. This is a quote from the 3 people who started this project. And it's interesting in relation to the future and, again, money. We wanted to make and share posters to support our lifesavers, inspire others to stay at home and not to forget to keep smiling. We also wanted to keep the creative community active. These times are tough for us designers. We're doing everything pro bono and we're fully transparent. Practically, we're at a point where we really have to find ways to generate income to keep us and the project alive. And I think it's because it's been such a success that they are spending all their time running this project. So I'm just going to close with 2 pieces. This is interesting because Michael Beirut in the New York Times was asked to comment on some of the work that designers are producing at the moment. And he, of course, was very positive about it. But he cited this, which is an infographic in the Washington Post, as the thing that he thought was most effective in terms of graphic design right now. And it's really a very simple infographic that shows how quickly contagion happens. And I thought it was interesting that this is what he cited as the most impressive piece of graphics that he'd seen at the time about COVID. And I'm going to close with this. Going back to the core question, can graphic design save your life? Now, I mean, clearly graphic design on its own can't save lives. That's not the message, really. The point is about the context and what we can do to help amplify messages, what we do to arrest attention, what we do to help people engage with our work and therefore the messages. So whilst we can't save lives on our own, I'm pretty clear that we can make a very positive difference. But I also think there's another way in which graphic design can save lives, and actually creative endeavour more broadly can save lives. So this was a book that was in our exhibition, and it was put together by an illustrator called Katie Green, and it tells the story of her experience of anorexia. And in our book, we asked everyone whose work was shown to answer the question, can graphic design save your life? And most answers, of course, were referencing wide questions about health. But she said, part of the narrative of Lighter Than My Shadow, which is the name of the book, is the evolution of the book itself. My idea was to create the book I wish had been there during my own struggles. Whether I achieved that or not, I found that the process of distilling my own experience into a story gave me focus, a reason to get up in the morning, and motivation to continue my own recovery. Yes, I believe but on countless occasions, feeling impelled to continue drawing this book did save my life. And I think that's a valuable thing too, and something that designers actually, we don't often talk about mental health. I know we're talking more about it now, but also that, you know, life's hard. And when you're involved in a creative endeavor like graphic design, you know, it can be tough. There are knocks, certainly, but it also kind of gives you a reason to be, and it makes you feel useful. And for me, I think that's one of the best things. And I would say, like her, really, that I think, yeah, graphic design has saved my life too. The end.
Lucy, thank you so much. Fabulous talk, really strong examples. We have, as I understand it, about 15 minutes. So I have a few questions or comments, and I think we're going to have time for a few questions from the audience as well, if any have come in. The subject of your talk, first off, if you'll forgive me, actually reminded me of a somewhat old joke. It's the scene of an accident. A concerned crowd has gathered around an injured person lying unconscious on the street. And then from the back of the crowd, a voice is heard. "Let me through, I'm a typographer." Obviously, as designers, as you said, we can't heal the sick. But as your talk explained, there are ways in which we can put our skills to good use to benefit society. I think it's fair to say that maybe compared to 30 years ago, we have what we might call an expanded field of design. And in the sense that we're not just hired guns, we can initiate projects, as you've shown, we can publish, we can curate, and your work really exemplifies this. So you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask, how did this particular career path start for you? And what lessons or observations could you share with students who are beginning their own career paths? Is it about sort of finding and choosing your clients? Is that possible?
I think the thing was, I had quite a clear idea when I left college anyway, of the kind of work I wanted to do. But I often say when I speak to students, actually, I showed that book, the Women's Press book, how, you know, there are just bits of good fortune, aren't there? And I responded to an advert about the Women's Press. I was very interested in them. I was reading some of their books. And now I think, wow, I was so lucky to go there as a junior designer, because I met so many other people there who sort of took me with them on their journey, if you like, because they were all quite politically engaged. And a lot of them ended up working with charities and NGOs, and some of them went into government actually. And you know, so I have them to thank, because there was suddenly this whole connection thing going on, of, you know, which I was just part of, but I was a beneficiary of. And so that's one thing I would say is that it is important to be careful what you do, particularly if you have a very clear idea in the way that I did about what I did and didn't want to do. Because I was offered a job at quite a big design agency, and I knew that just didn't feel right. But I know it's not, you know, it's hard sometimes to be. I was lucky. I was very, very lucky.
Right. It sort of links to the next point I wanted to make, that much of your work centers on, obviously, ethical design. And you've written that book that we saw, that you showed us, Good, An Introduction to Ethics in Graphic Design. As we know, a lot of design is about making other people look good, their messaging or the organizations themselves. And so, you know, all designers and students really have to think about what kind of work they want to take on. Who do you actually want to make look good? At the same time, obviously, we all have to balance the fact that we've got bills to pay and rent, so forth. I personally can think of 3 projects that I turned down for ethical reasons. My point being, as designers, as you touched upon, we all have to, you know, draw the line somewhere. What would your advice be to students on this issue?
If I can interject a little bit to round out, because we do have some questions that kind of fit into this, Simon and Lucy. Some people really want to know about the process of you organizing and financing your exhibitions. And I think that ties into, how do you go about having a career that you feel is ethical, that you feel follows your path. So in terms of organizing and planning and the process, and finding the funds
Yeah,
to do the work that you want to do.
And I have to say, I think it's probably, I would think it's much harder as a younger designer to do it now than it was when I did it, because there were just less of us. There were less designers, but I suppose, I think if you have a very clear sense, then you kind of have to, I have had to accept that I'm not going to earn the kind of money that some other designers earn. That's the bottom line of it. Because it's very clearly the case that the more commercial projects pay better. And we tend to work in the cultural sector or charity sector and so on, and, you know. But that doesn't mean you can't get it to work. And actually it's still, you know, it's what's in your heart, really. So in terms of the finances, it's a bit rocky, can be a bit up and down, but we've managed, we've pulled it off so far, you know. And I think you have to be thinking about the greater good, don't you, all the time, really. In terms of the process with exhibitions, you asked specifically about that. That's really interesting that we put together the proposal for what became Graphic Design Save Your Life in our own time, unpaid. We did a lot of research on that basis first. Then we went to the Welcome. It was at that point that once they commissioned, that they did pay a fee, of course, as curators, and they paid a fee as designers. But we had to do a lot of the running first, if you like. And with the politics exhibition at the Design Museum, that was interesting because we had also gone to them with a proposal a few years ago, actually. And at the time they'd said no, and then they came back to us in 2017 and said, actually, we are interested now. Can you rework your proposal? So again, we had to do that free before there was any money. So that's the thing, it involves quite a lot of upfront free activity and being a bit pushy. You know.
Was there any pushback from the curators of the museum or the wellness center about what to include?
Yeah, so we had to work, in both cases, we worked very closely with in-house curators. So, which was a great experience for us, actually. At the Welcome, there was one curator assigned to us, and the Design Museum the same, who was there to represent the museum, really. And we learned a tremendous amount from it, because I mean, we are not professional curators, and I think what we learned was, and what I thoroughly enjoyed actually, was that it's storytelling, you know, and that when you put one object next to another object, it changes the story of both of them. And that was something that, although I sort of knew in the abstract, I hadn't fully appreciated until trying it. And you could feel, particularly with Save Your Life, actually, because we had a decent amount of time to do the research for that, was the politics show was put together at enormous speed. But with Save Your Life, that it was a really lovely process of teasing out until you get to the richest and most diverse projects, you know. So I learned a lot from that experience, and but I'm also very respectfully rated as a result.
I think we might have one more question from another wonderful designer, Tracy Schiffman, who loves your brain. So she wants to know, how do you deal with design and teaching in the age of what she calls fake news? Do you feel that you have a problem distinguishing messaging from real, you know, to not real? Is that a huge concern?
Actually, what's interesting, it's less to do with teaching more broadly, but when we worked on the politics show, it became clearer and clearer to us that graphics is part of the problem. The democratization of graphic design is part of the problem, because, you know, we showed the Crooked Hillary campaign, which, you know, nobody, because it looked like bona fide graphic design, nobody asked who'd done it and why, because it looked authoritative, you know. And actually that's my concern. So in terms of how I talk to students about it, that's one of the things that I'll raise, is that I think we're in a very difficult period in that graphic design can be, you know, it can make something look legitimate when it isn't.
Yeah.
You know. And I think we as professional designers, you know, there are lots of issues like that that are coming up. And also the question about authenticity came up a lot through that show, I think. That, you know, the reason why Brexit, you know, why that campaign worked here, I think was because it had this sort of rawness about it that made it feel more authentic. And the people were very wary of the government campaign. They didn't trust the government. Because actually, well, I'm a Remainer, so, but you know, it was, that's thrown up lots of issues around what seemed to be authentic and trustworthy. And that's partly a byproduct. It's the backlash against, you know, corporate slick design. Okay, we can't trust that. So we're going to, you know, it's really, the whole thing's become very muddled, very difficult as a designer to navigate your way through, I think. And I don't know, we'll have to see how if the dust settles.
But we just have a few more minutes, Simon, well, 4 minutes. So I don't know if you have any more pertinent things you must ask Lucy or anyone else. If we don't get to your questions, you can always find Lucy. And I think we put it up already where to find you. But Simon, if you have any more questions.
I did have a sort of follow-on thought about the relationship between governments and design, which relates to what you were just mentioning there. It seems to me in the US, there's always been a bit of a disconnect between design and government policy, perhaps less so in countries, well, look at the currency for a start, but less so in countries like, say, Holland, where a lot of government-sponsored design, you know, it's taken very seriously. And I wonder, for example, even in the UK, those NHS signs, is there an in-house government design group? Do we need a minister of design for it to be taken seriously?
That would be amazing, wouldn't it? I mean, I know the campaigns here go out to agencies, you know, and I've no idea. It'd be fascinating to know a bit more about the commissioning process.
Yeah, we had discussed this the other day. I think it's very difficult. You know, when you look at the messaging now, again, I think Simon and I both agree with you. You know, we have a sort of a distrust in messaging, a sort of distrust in, you know, what we're seeing, what we're reading. And I think it really does bow to the fact that graphic design has become so powerful in terms of its ability to convey information. And there's always that double-edged sword. But I think that, you know, it's something it gives all of us pause to think about. It gives students pause to think about, you know, it gives teachers pause to think about, you know, what they convey to their students, the importance of design. And I can only hope that it gives governments pause to think about, or the general public to understand that, you know, it's still content that's important, you know, again.
Absolutely.
So Simon and Lucy, before we end, I want to thank you so much.
Pleasure.
You have been, both have been terrific. This has been such a pleasure to have you and to have everyone here. But thank you, Lucy, and I hope to see you again soon. And again, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a few days for our next one. So thank you for attending.
Lucy.
Bye, Lucy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.